And today we're going to continue to look at proportions and rates and ratios. And we're going to be looking at lesson 21-2 to do this. And our focus for today's lesson will be finding the part given a percent and the whole. So our highlighted terms are going to be kind of the key aspects we're going to be looking at today's lesson. Now, before we get into today's lesson, we're going to need to know a couple vocabulary terms, and they have to do with interest because that's what we're going to be looking at today. So our first vocabulary term is interest. And basically what interest is, it is the amount of money paid for letting another person or business use your money. So if I lent you $100 and I wanted you to pay back interest on that $100, I might say, I want 5% interest back. And 5% of 100 would be $5. So my interest on the $100 I lent you would be $5. And so you would pay back 105 instead of just 100 because you paid interest on it. Now the next term goes directly with interest, and that's actually our interest rate. And what this interest rate is a percent of the total amount of money borrowed that needs to be paid back in addition to the amount borrowed. So interest rate is how you figure out how much money you are going to pay back in addition to what you already borrowed. So there's kind of a little equation that can help you with this is when you're looking at paying interest on money borrowed, it's your money borrowed plus whatever interest, however much money the interest came up to, equals the total money paid back. And so like I said, if I borrowed $100 and I borrowed it at a 5% interest rate, 5% of 100 would just be 5. So I would have $100 plus the $5 of interest, meaning that I would have paid a total of $105 in order to borrow that 100. And that's kind of what interest rate is. It's just additional money that you have to pay back when you borrow money from a business or a person. So now that we have our important vocabulary for this lesson, we're going to look at an example of what do you do when you come across this. And so our example for today is going to be this scenario. And it wants us to find the interest of a 2% interest rate loan of $3,000 for a year. Now, yesterday we talked about proportions, and that proportions are essentially equivalent ratios. And if we can break apart the information that we're given with the proportion setup with percent, with our part to our percent and whole, then we can fill this in. So I want you to remember that our proportion setup should be percent over 100, because remember percent is per 100, equals part to whole. And anytime you see a percent symbol, this is going to represent our first proportion. And then you look and decide on your second pieces of information. So I know I have a 2% interest rate. So I know I'm looking for 2%. And my loan, my total of my loan is $3,000. And this is going to be paid in 1 year. So I know I have the percent and I have the whole. So with that information, I can actually set up my proportion. So my first step when finding the interest rate is going to be to set up the proportion. So I'm going to start off with my percent because my percent's going to go into my first proportion, and it's very clearly marked here with the 2 and then the percent symbol. So I'm going to say 2%, 2 per 100, that's 2%, equals, I don't know what 2% of 3,000 is, so that is my variable. I don't know what 2% is, but I know that my total was 3,000. So this 3,000 is the whole, which is amount borrowed, amount of money borrowed. Our numerator is our unknown. And right here, this was our 2%. So that's kind of how we got this set up. Our 2%, 2 per 100, our 3,000, which was our total, our total amount borrowed, and then our unknown is our variable of what that 2% interest rate actually is. Once we have that set up and know how to do that, we're going to move on to the next step, which is step 2. And for step 2, you are going to set up the equation from your proportion. So I'm going to take my proportion of 2%, 2 per 100, equaling, because this is my equivalent ratio, my part, x, which is unknown, to my whole, which is 3,000. Now, to set up my equation, I'm just going to cross multiply in order to do this. So I'm going to start over here and cross multiply 100 times x. And then I'm going to make this equal to the other direction, which is 2 times 3,000. So I have 2 times 3,000. So now I simplify this equation. So 100 times x is 100x, and 2 times 3,000 is 6,000. And now I have an equation I can actually solve, which leads us to our next step. So step 3 is going to be solve the equation. So I'm going to take 100x equaling 6,000, and I am going to simplify it. I'm going to start off with isolating my variable. So I see that 100 is my coefficient to my variable x, so I need to get x alone. This is multiplying, so I know the opposite of multiplying is to divide. So I'm going to divide by my coefficient 100. And what I do to one side, I do to the other. So I'm going to divide by 100 on each side. I can now solve this because 100 divided by 100 is going to give me 1x, which is just basically x by itself. And then on my other side of my equation, I'm going to have 6,000 divided by 100, which is going to give me 60. I now know that my unknown, my part, is 60. So I know that they're going to pay $60 on their loan of $3,000. So my last step is my solution. And I'm going to write that out. Solution. So our answer will say the interest is $60 on a $3,000 loan at the interest rate of 2% for 1 year. So our borrower will pay $3,060 in total for borrowing this money for a year. And that's how we come up with the missing part to how much they'll be getting paid. I'd like to also reiterate that in order to solve these types of problems, you need to remember our proportion setup, which are equivalent ratios. And we're looking for percent over 100, so per 100% equals part to your whole. All right, I want you to go ahead and try this on your own. I have a Google quiz for you, so just click on the link right above this video, and do the 4 questions. And we will take a look at this tomorrow. Have a great evening.